Hi, Misha here, and it's time for another black box video recorded very late at night. But this one's going to not be about anything current or even fictional. We're going to talk about the Doolittle raid, April 18, 1942. And the reason I'm doing this as a black box, I recently acquired a new model from Corgi, 172 scale diecast, of a B-25J Mitchell, a late Mitchell from World War II, 1945. And in the past, I've shown videos of my Doolittle Raid Mitchell, which is a B-25B, somewhat heavily modified for that mission. And since I've been wanting and starting to revisit older models with the new camera, it seemed like a great time to talk about the B and the J. That sounded weird. Anyway, but as I was getting notes ready for the main video on the models, I realized that if I said all I wanted to say in that video about the Doolittle raid, it would mostly just be me pointing the camera at the model for a long period of time. So, this is a companion video to the model video, talking in more detail about the Doolittle raid, although please don't consider this comprehensive. There are literally books written on this very interesting event. But I thought I would share my take, because I certainly don't want to ignore it. It really was very important in both America and Japan. And, of course, the aircraft involved were important in and of themselves. So, the origins. Of course, December 7, the day that'll live in infamy, Pearl Harbor. And as early as December 21st, 1941, during a meeting, President Roosevelt wanted a way to hit the Japanese homeland, the mainland, the archipelago. But of course, how to do that? Japan had been expanding their sphere of influence throughout the Pacific, and bombers of the day really didn't have the range, especially naval bombers, or the capacity. So, with this from the commander-in-chief, people in the military were kind of thinking. Now, of course, at this time, the Air Force was not an independent branch. It was the U.S. Army Air Corps, under the Army naturally. Later in the war, it'd be renamed the U.S. Army Air Forces. But in late 41, still the Air Corps. And actually, the genesis of the raid started off with a naval captain in charge of submarine warfare, anti-submarine warfare rather, who got the idea in early January. It might be crazy, but it might just work to take Army Air Corps 2-engine bombers, put them on an aircraft carrier, and fly them off and hit Japan. So, on January 10th, 1942, he took this insane notion to essentially the commander of the Admiralty, Admiral King, who's not known, especially early in the war, for a lot of great decisions, but this is one of the times he really was on the top of things, and he liked the idea, and he pointed out the fact that they had this new spanking carrier, the USS Hornet, that was still undergoing sea trials, and had a very long flight deck. So this might just be possible. So now the Army Air Corps gets more involved with this cockamamie scheme. And very soon, a Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle is essentially put in charge of the project. Now, Doolittle was no starry-eyed novice. Before the war, he was a civil pilot, aviator. He was even an aeronautics engineer and designer to some extent. and he had volunteered for the war effort for obvious reasons. So, pretty good credentials there. He was also very ambitious and very brave. No other way to put it. So the first thing, which aircraft in the Army Air Corps inventory might just work? Well, he looked at the existing planes. The B-17 and the B-24, too big, too heavy, not gonna work. He looked at the B-23 Dragon, and while it might have worked, it had a little bit too wide of a wingspan for comfort. So, he was kind of left with one of the oldest planes and the newest planes in the Air Corps' inventory. The B-18 Bolo, which dated back to the 1920s, and the new and untested B-25 Mitchell. In the end, he selected the Mitchell because the B-18 was simply too old, too dated, and ironically also a little too big. So it was thought that just maybe the B-25 could pull this thing off. So to test things out, on February 3rd, 2 of them were loaded aboard the USS Hornet over at Virginia and were flown off the deck, and it worked. So with this, the mission was given an immediate go-ahead. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the B-25 Mitchell here, that's for the main model video, but just to hit a few of the highlights and why it was so remarkable for this mission. The design really did date back, in some ways, to the B-18 Bolo. It was a North American design, started off as the NA-40, then the NA-40B. It lost out to several planes throughout the 1930s, but then in 1939, the U.S. Air Corps wanted a new concept, a medium-range bomber. In the end, they selected the North American NA-62 and kind of a secondary choice that would become the B-26 Marauder. And typically, before the war, they would do an experimental plane, like an XB. Then they would do a prototype or pre-production series, YB. But nope. No time, no room for that bullshit. In September of 1939, they just straight up ordered 184 of the now designated B-25 North Americans. So the test would be of the first production, really. And the first plane was ready to go in the summer of 1940, and would first fly in August of 1940 on the 19th. And had a few changes made to things like the wings early on. The original B-25 was not really considered combat ready. They only would make about 24 of those. Then they would switch to the B-25A, with the big differences being armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. Fuel tanks were good, but they took the fuel capacity from over 900 gallons to under 700. But self-sealing tanks were proving already by 1940 to be just an absolute must. So they had to sacrifice some range, but it was well worth it so their aircraft wouldn't be Ronson lighters. The armament, self-defense armament, was pretty light at this time. You only had a 30 cal machine gun in the nose, and early on you had a 50 cal single tail gun, and then you had 30 cal waist guns. That was with the 25A. And they would build about 40 of this model. And the Army Air Corps would take delivery of their first full production models in February of 1941. I think there was 5 of them. And the 17th bombardment group would be the first to transition over. And honestly, they were already pretty much fully switched over by September of 1941. And also by this point, a new model was coming online, the B-25B. And this would have a few changes to the airframe and such, but the main thing we're really concerned with here is the defense. They would get rid of those 30 cal waist guns, and they would get rid of the single 50 cal tail gun. Instead, they would put a turret on top with two 50 cal guns, and an interesting retractable turret on the underside with two 50 cal guns. So the rear protection went from one gun to four. The bomb load was, depending on the setup of the airframe, but about 2,000 pounds, depending on range and whatnot. And the top speed of this aircraft, especially the 25B with the added weight and drag of the turrets, was about 270 to 275 miles per hour. Maximum altitude of about 23 to 24,000 feet. And luckily they were able to take off in pretty short distances. Another thing that helped, especially for launching from a carrier, this was an early user of the tricycle landing gear arrangement, which has many advantages. And it was a 2-engine Wright Cyclone, a bit of a conservative engine design, but it stood it good. But why not? So that was the aircraft, and they picked the B-25B for this mission, or rather Doolittle did, even though it had never really been in combat. It had only been used at the beginning of the war for coastal patrols, anti-submarine patrols, and of course training, but never really combat. So it's a very much untested machine. But nevertheless, it had the criteria to fit the bill, so that's what they went with. In February, they started to really plan the mission. The 17th Bombardment Group was transferred to the East Coast, and then were asked to volunteer for a highly secret, highly dangerous mission, but not given any details. It was decided to pick 24 crews, each of 5 men, and to pick 25 aircraft for modifications. Now the plan at the early outset was to have 20 aircraft, so the extra 5 were just to have spares, which proved to be a very good call. So, plans are underway to modify the planes, and plans are underway to train these Army flyers to actually operate from and fly off of a naval carrier. And starting on March 1, 1942, for roughly 3 weeks, training would commence at day and especially at night in Florida. Training was virtually 24/7, exceedingly rigorous, and as thorough as they could be. They would kind of chalk out, flag out a mock-up of a carrier deck and practice taking off from it. Now, there was never any hope of landing. Never was going to happen. The B-25 didn't have a tail hook. It could never land on a carrier. So early on, they were hoping they could land in Siberia, Soviet Russia. But the Russians quickly nixed this because they had a non-aggression pact, a neutrality agreement with Japan. And they didn't really have any ability to defend their eastern flank at that time, so they said no. However, King Chiang Kai-shek of China agreed to let the aircraft land at Chinese airfields. It was further by several hours, but it was hoped with modifications they could just about make it. So they started training the crews to take off. Now the Hornet would give, at least the lead aircraft, about 467 feet to take off in. So they went ahead and chalked it out to 400 feet or less. And then, of course, aircrew being aircrew, they began competing to see who could take off in the shortest distance. And I know several achieved under 300 feet takeoff. I think the record was like 273 or something. It was crazy low for a medium bomber of that day and time. Now, at this time, the Navy was still involved. Of course, they're going to be flying from one of their carriers. So they have an attaché, Lieutenant Miller, who's helping train them on naval etiquette and protocol to work on their ships and to help fly the B-25 and figure out how to make sure it works well on the decks. Also at this time, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle was not going to lead the raid. However, remember I said he was pretty ambitious. He flew up to Washington, and in late March he did some politicking with the generals and whatnot at the Pentagon, and essentially got himself put on the mission. Now, training was very tough, and of the 25 planes assigned, 3 of them were lost to accidents and damage and wear. So 22 were ready to go. Luckily, even though the planes were lost, no crew were killed and only minor injuries suffered. So, at the end of March, around the 30th, 31st, everything is packed up and they do a cross-country flight, low level, to California. So they get over there, San Francisco, and they look through all the planes and everything. They have 22 planes left, and 16 are judged to be airworthy. So with that, let's talk about the modifications done to the B-25B to extend its range and capabilities to actually hit Japan and hopefully land somewhere safe afterwards. Basically, everything was done to increase fuel capacity, improve fuel consumption rates, and to remove any unnecessary equipment and thus weight. For example, the ventral turret, which never worked well and many other crews was removed. Now, with the 25B, there's no longer a tail gun. You just have that. So by removing the bottom turret, you're already having the firepower. You just have the 250 cals up top and the 130 cal up front. One of the most interesting things they did was they took what are called broomsticks and made dummy anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, in the little bubble observation blister at the back of the plane to make it look like the planes had additional rearward-facing defense to try to deter Japanese fighters. They also pulled out equipment like the radio sets. Again, I remember in World War II, radio sets were pretty heavy. Well, they didn't need them because, heck, it was going to be under radio silence anyway. They pulled out other equipment they didn't need, even sometimes getting pretty anal about it. And at the same time, they increased fuel. They put an extra fuel tank in the bomb bay. But then they put flexible fuel bladders everywhere they could. They put them where the ventral turret used to be. They put them hanging from the ceiling of the bomb bay. They put them hanging from the sides. Heck, they even gave the radio man in the rear 10 5-gallon fuel canisters to top off the tanks. There was a spout he could use to top off the added tank where the ventral turret used to be, to just give it that little extra bit of 50 gallons of fuel during flight. Heck, even the tanks, even the cans themselves were made out of tin, and they would even punch holes in them to throw them out the door to save the weight and to not give a trail that they were coming, because this was a super secret mission. And again, even at this point in March, no one knows what they're doing. I mean, they can speculate, but no one knows the details. So yeah, everything they can think of to do. They even tune the planes, adjust this, adjust that. And of course, it's never enough, but they did their best. The internal fuel storage was upped to over 1,100 gallons. And the typical bomb load would be 3 500-pound bombs plus a fourth 500-pound incendiary device, although some planes would just carry 4 500-pound bombs. So here we are. We have our specially modified planes. And then on April 1st, 1942, we load them aboard the USS Hornet. And this is historic for Hornet. This is the first time she's going into combat, as well as the first time the B-25 is going into combat. And sadly, this is also the last time Hornet would see an American port, because she would be lost later that year in October. But that's a story for one of my ship videos. So they get all these aircraft on board the carrier, and originally they were going to take 15 aboard. But they decide, hey, they ask the Navy, can we fit a 16th on board? And they say, okay. And the idea was, well, just to inspire confidence, we're going to get out to sea and then take plane number 16, fly it off the Hornet, back to shore on the west coast, just to show it can be done. Okay? So they load it up. They get as ready as they can. Still, no one knows what the deuce is going on. And Hornet leaves port on April 2nd. And as she's just clearing the harbor and making it out to ocean, the blimp L8, which I've done a video on, the Ghost Blimp video, makes one final delivery of parts and needed supplies for the raid. So she's actually underway, and they're delivering parts on April 3rd. So, of course, L8 leaves, and she goes into history as her own fate. Everything in this video is kind of fated. And she's steaming towards the Pacific. And her next plan is to rendezvous with the USS Enterprise, who's going to leave port at Pearl Harbor on April 8. And the reason is several. I mean, to provide support, but because of the B-25s on the deck of the USS Hornet, they can't go under the, into the hangar because they're way too big. So she can't launch her aircraft. So if she launches her fighters, they're going to have to push the bombers off the deck and scrub the mission. So Enterprise is going to be there to give air cover. She will also have 3 heavy cruiser and 1 light cruiser for escorts, and a few destroyers, and 2 fuel tankers, fuel ships will be there. And when they meet up on April 13th, the task group, or Task Force 16, is formed. They meet up in the ocean, and they steam for Japan. Now, it is hoped they can launch the mission on April 19, getting as close to the coast as possible. 400 miles would be great. 500 would be okay. Over 650, being kind of pushing it. So they sail out, and then finally, everyone kind of is keyed in. The crew on the Hornet were told a little earlier than the crew on the Enterprise are told. The April 14 is just a lost day because they crossed the international date line, so we kind of jump from the 13th to the 15th. And then final preps are being made on the 17th. The refuelers top everyone off and then head back with the destroyers. So now it's just the cruisers and the 2 carriers, and things are being made ready to go, because they might have to launch at any time. They're in enemy-held territory. They could be spotted. Now, you might be thinking I'm forgetting about that 16th aircraft, why they didn't do that little test flight. Well, kind of like the camel getting its nose under the tent. Once they're already underway, everyone goes, well, we could just use that 16th plane and add to the bombing raid. And so that's exactly what they do. They go out with 16 aircraft. And up until the night of the 17th, Colonel Doolittle is asking everyone, are you sure you want to do this? It's voluntary. Anyone who steps out, not only will there be no questions, there will be no marks against you on your record, but this is the American military in early 1942, so it should come as no surprise that no one stepped out. So, April 18, the weather's bad, it's overcast, it's windy, it's a little stormy, rainy, not great, and they are afraid early on that morning before dawn they might have been spotted by some Japanese trawlers and junks or what have you, but they initially avoid detection. Their luck does run out about 7:30 that morning when a Japanese fishing boat and patrol boat spots them and radios their position. One of the cruisers does obliterate it, but not before they can get a message out. So it's basically said, alright, here we go. We gotta launch now because the Hornet's defenseless, and Enterprise and Hornet are too valuable. If the U.S. were to have lost those two carriers in April of 1942, it would have been very, very bad. So it's kind of a make or break. Unfortunately, they're just under that line of being about 650 miles off the coast of mainland Japan, Honshu province. And they're going to have to launch about 10-12 hours earlier than hoped. So, taking the lead, as you know he would, Doolittle's aircraft takes off about 8:20 that morning, leading the way. He only has, like I said, about 460 some odd feet of runway, and he clears it with a good 10 feet to spare. It really helped him because they had a good headwind, and they rode the waves to really maximize their kind of catapult into the air. And it took them a little while to get all the aircraft in the air, but they did. All 16 launched, even though one of them forgot to set their flaps for takeoff, and so a little bit more of a squeaky takeoff than they would have hoped for. But they all get airborne. Hornet's able to get her fighters ready to go, and her and Enterprise turn around and head back home. And really not a moment too soon, because Japan gets word of this actually as early as April 16. They're suspicious something's going on. So already by the 20th, she has many of her naval assets combing the ocean looking for the two U.S. carriers. But they take a unexpected route back home and make it back without a scratch, and even have 5 prisoners from that Japanese ship they sunk. And with that, the Doolittle raid is underway. Radio silence. And they get over Tokyo, Japan, a little after noon, about 6 hours into the flight. So they are over their target. Tokyo is the primary target, and Doolittle gave very strict orders to go for military targets, industrial complexes, military bases, what have you. They hit 5 targets or so in Tokyo. They also hit a target in about 4 other Japanese cities nearby. And amazingly, not one of the aircraft is shot down. Only one of them is hit with minor damage, and only one of them had to drop their payload early. So out of the 16, 50 of them were able to get over their target and drop their payload. Again, with Doolittle more or less leading the pack. This is also interesting because this is one of the first times, really the first time, the Key 61 aircraft is used, the interceptor. These were early production or even prototype models used in April of 42. And because of its resemblance to the Bf-109, the Messerschmitt, some identified it as just that, and were kind of confused why they were seeing German planes over Japan. So they drop their payload, and then they head for China. How did they do? Well, the damage was relatively light, although it did exist. They did hit some targets. Roughly 50 Japanese were killed, and 400 were injured. Many were military, but some were, unfortunately, civilians. And some fires were started, and some minor damage was done to factories. So, flying on, we get to the end of the mission. We're about 13 hours in it now, so we're around dark, 8, 9, 10 o'clock p.m. The one aircraft was very low on fuel, for whatever reason. They had no choice but to land in Vladivostok, Russia. Now, they had been given strict orders not to land in Russia because Russia was neutral, but they just did not have a choice. Interestingly, this was the only plane to actually land and survive the raid, but the crew and the plane would be interned in Russia. 13 others were going to China, but the arrangements were not properly made to kind of lead them in to the Chinese airfields they were supposed to land at. Plus, they were very low on fuel from having launched early, so the 13 planes that made it safely had to ditch. 2 more would basically go silent. Now, those 2, it turns out, would be captured by the Japanese. So we have 13 that were successfully ditched and rescued by the Chinese allies, 2 that were captured by the Japanese enemy, and 1 crew that was in the hands of a quote-unquote neutral party in this theater. There were a total of 80 people on this raid. Now, the loss rate was very good at the beginning. 77 survived. 3 were killed. 1 would be killed when he bailed out of his aircraft, and 2 more would bail out successfully but then drowned in the ocean. So not bad ratio. Of the ones that made it to ground safely, 8 would be captured by the Japanese. Of the 69 remaining, well, it'd take them a while to get back home. The ones in China would sometimes fight for a bit there, and then would be kind of repatriated, rejoined Allied forces at various times throughout 1942. The crew in Russia, by their account, were treated well, and Russia, not wanting to jeopardize its position with Japan, took a little time to figure out what to do, so it kind of arranged a planned escape in May of 1943, getting them over the border into British-held Iran, so they would make it back safe and sound. Really no worse for wear, except for about a year-long vacation in Siberia. Yay. And obviously the worst fate would be those 8 captured by the Japanese. They would be put on trial in August of 1942, and originally all would be sentenced to death. They was accused that they strafed civilians, they targeted civilians. Obviously bunk, but what do you do? Luckily for most, all but 3 had their sentences commuted to life with hard labor. 3 were shot, though. I think it was in October of that year. So 5 are in captivity as POWs. Unfortunately, 1 perishes from disease, malnutrition, because you know how they're being treated. This is Japanese POW camp. So I think it was April or May of 1943. The other 4 start to receive a little bit better treatment towards the end of the war for obvious reasons, because they know they're losing, and so they do survive the war. 3 of them recover quite quickly. A 4th man is pretty well shaken physically and mentally, but eventually recovers himself. What about Colonel Doolittle. After the mission, while still in China, Doolittle told his men that he expected when he got back to friendly lines they would be court-martialed. He felt like the raid was unsuccessful, that they had not really destroyed any targets, and that he had lost all 16 of the aircraft entrusted to him. Keep in mind, this is a brand new aircraft at a time when the U.S. is woefully short of aircraft. That's not exactly what happened. When he gets back home, he's not court-martialed. Rather, he's given the Medal of Honor, and President Roosevelt gives him a standing ovation. And considering Roosevelt's condition, that is a huge sign of success and esteem and respect. So politically, he's rewarded. But even in the military, he's rewarded. He is promoted 2 ranks from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, and would continue to lead the fight actively throughout World War II, as would many of his men. Unfortunately, some would be killed in the war, others would be injured. But this was not their ticket out of the war, nor did they want it to be. To them, it was just another day at the office, really. But they were all honored. Doolittle insisted that all of his men get a promotion in rank. All received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Many were given Purple Hearts. And of course, the ones who died were given full honors. And again, a tribute to now General Doolittle's character. He helped many of his men during and after the war with both physical and emotional problems, which has to be admired. What about the impact on a global scale? I mean, it's nice to hear about the human effort, and it certainly did help the B-25 Mitchell's reputation. In fact, by this point, North American is opening a second plant in Kansas to produce more of them. So it was definitely a very positive combat debut for a very successful company of World War II. Well, as you know, it was a huge propaganda victory for America. After Pearl Harbor, morale was low. And not only did this give them a win when they really needed one, it showed them the determination of their Navy and Air Force, and of course everyone else. And it really showed that Japan was not inviolate, was not safe. And of course, as the war would go on, it would only become more so as the Essex-class carriers came online, as better and better bombers came online, more range like the B-29. The noose would only tighten. But this was the very first step. This was the very first strike. And of course, it would shake many Japanese citizens' ironclad trust in their government and their safety. More importantly, this would force Admiral Yamamoto to speed up his planned invasion of a little island called Midway. Because of this raid, because of how close the Hornet Enterprise got to the Japanese mainland, it was thought that Japan needed to expand its sphere of influence in the Pacific and kind of solidify its holds that it had. So the invasion of Midway was brought up to the beginning of June 1942. And this was important because this meant Japan only had 4 carriers to throw at this invasion. For Pearl Harbor, they had 6. But Shokoku and Zoikoku were not available for various reasons in May of 1942. So Hiryu, Shoryu, Akagi, and Kaga would go it alone. Yamamoto still thought he had the advantage, which on paper he might have done, But thanks to American code breaking, well, you know how the Battle of Midway went. So while the Doolittle raid didn't do a lot of damage, it was the first domino to fall, which led to the Battle of Midway, which led to the Guadalcanal campaign, which ultimately led to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and so on and so forth, all the way up to the invasion of Okinawa. And of course, the Doolittle raid showed the validity of strategic bombing, even in the Pacific. And also just the whole thinking outside of the box thing. It really was a crazy notion. But it wasn't 100% all America's way, all the Allies' way. Just as some Japanese became more fearful and distrustful of the government after the raid, many others felt similar to Americans after the Pearl Harbor attack. Yes, Japanese civilians were injured and killed during the raid. The Japanese used this to galvanize the war effort, getting more people to volunteer, to sign up, which would ultimately lead to things like the kamikaze missions. It also led to more people in the factories to help production, and it really made it a more personal thing for the Japanese civilians. Likewise, the Japanese military, especially the army, took it as a personal affront, and unfortunately they took it out by having reprisals on the Chinese, especially those who sheltered the American flyers when they came down. At least 50 were killed directly for having given food and comfort and shelter to the Americans. If that were the end of it, you could maybe understand, if not agree with. But that's not it. This was used as an excuse, a springboard, to launch a whole reign of terror in China. Many rapes, many murders, even I can't talk, it's late, bacteriological warfare was conducted there. In fact, it was said that the reprisals from the Doolittle raids in China were on par with the rape of Nanking, it's said. And some say that as many as 250,000 Chinese died because of it. But keep this in perspective. The Japanese were ruthless. It's very possible that even if the Doolittle raid hadn't happened, and if Midway had happened, they might have done the exact same thing as reprisals for Midway. The fact is, the Japanese were upset, and they were bullies, and they went after the weaker target, which unfortunately were Chinese civilians. But still, it has to be noted. Also, after the war, 4 Japanese officers deemed responsible for the deaths of the 4 POWs were tried and sentenced to hard labor for, I think it was 9 years. And so they did not go unpunished, although they weren't executed, although other Japanese were for different things. So yeah, very interesting part, and the B-25 was instrumental. If they had not had that exact aircraft, it probably would not have gone off the way it did. It had just enough range with modifications and had heavy enough of a bomb load to make this worthwhile. And it was just the first of many bomb raids in the Pacific. The B-25 was mostly used there. However, it was also used very heavily later in 1942 in North Africa and also into the Sicilian and Italian campaigns. But it pretty much stopped there. They never really used it over Germany. Instead, they used other planes because different needs. But it was a very successful design. Production would last until 1945. They would build over 9,800. And it would remain in U.S. Army Air Force service until May of 1960. Although for the last 10 years of its service, it was basically a twin-engine trainer. It was still there. And several versions were built all the way up to the J, which I talk about in my other video. So yeah, I just wanted to do this. I think you see now why I didn't want to make it a part of the main model video, or it would have just dominated the video. So yeah, just one little story I thought was kind of interesting to share. What stories from the war do you find interesting? From either side. I also talk a lot about Japanese and Russian and other British activities as well. I'm not American-centric by any means, but this is definitely one that needs to be remembered and commemorated. And with that, I'll let you go. I appreciate you tuning in. As always, like, share, and subscribe, and all that good stuff. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.